Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, trapped inside a tent on a frozen mountain. The wind is screaming outside. The temperature is far below zero. You can barely see, barely think. And then something happens. Something so terrifying that staying inside suddenly feels more dangerous than running out into the snow. No boots, no proper jacket, no time, just fear. That is exactly what happened to 9 experienced hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959. When rescuers finally found their campsite, the tent had been cut open from the inside. The bodies were scattered across the snow, and every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. More than 60 years later, people are still asking the same thing. What happened at Dyatlov Pass? This case has stayed alive for so long because it doesn't feel like a normal tragedy. It feels wrong from the very beginning. These were not careless people. They were not reckless tourists who wandered into danger without knowing what they were doing. They were trained, organized, experienced, and used to brutal winter conditions. They understood the cold. They understood the mountains. They understood survival. And that is exactly why what happened to them is still so disturbing. If even they could end up like this, then whatever happened on that mountain must have been terrifying. The story begins in late January of 1959. In the Soviet Union, a group of 10 young hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a winter expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, a respected and capable student, and over time his name would become permanently tied to the mystery itself. The group included 8 men and 2 women, most of them in their early 20s. One of them, Semyon Zolotaryov, was older than the rest, a 38-year-old war veteran and experienced instructor. Together, they formed a strong and capable team, more than qualified for a difficult journey through deep snow and freezing wilderness. Their route would take them through one of the most remote and unforgiving regions imaginable. This was not a casual trip. It was a serious expedition through harsh terrain, violent winds, and extreme cold. And at first, everything seemed normal. We know that because they documented the journey. They kept diaries. They took photographs. They wrote about the weather, the terrain, the mood of the group. In those first entries, there is nothing that suggests the horror to come. There is cold, of course. There is fatigue, heavy snow, and long hours of walking. But there is also laughter, singing, conversation, and the kind of small human moments that make what happened later feel even sadder. Then something happened that probably felt like a disappointment at the time, but turned out to be the luckiest moment in the entire story. One of the members, Yuri Yudin, began suffering severe physical pain, likely caused by a health problem he already had. It became clear that he couldn't continue. So he said goodbye to the rest of the group and turned back. At that point, he had no reason to think he was escaping death. He was simply doing what he had to do. But that decision saved his life. Yuri Yudin would become the only member of the original group to survive. The remaining 9 continued on without him. As they moved deeper into the mountains, conditions became worse. The weather grew harsher. The wind became stronger. Visibility dropped. By the beginning of February, they were approaching one of the most dangerous parts of the route. On February 1st, it appears that the group lost direction in worsening weather and ended up on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, a name often translated as Mountain of the Dead. That detail sounds almost too perfect for a story like this, and maybe that is part of why the case has taken on such a dark life of its own. But long before people turned it into legend, it was simply a real mountain in a real wilderness, and something very real happened there. Instead of moving down into the forest for shelter, the group chose to camp on the exposed slope itself. That decision has been debated for decades. Maybe they did not want to lose altitude. Maybe they believed they could handle the conditions. Maybe they thought it would only be one difficult night and they could continue the next day. Whatever the reason, they cut into the snow, pitched their tent, settled in, and prepared to sleep. That was the last normal moment of the expedition. Because sometime during that night, something went terribly wrong. No one knows exactly when it started, No one knows what the first sound was, or who reacted first, or what was said inside that tent, but we know the result. At some point, all 9 hikers left the tent in a hurry. Not through the entrance, but by cutting their way out from the inside. That detail is one of the most chilling parts of the entire case, because it tells us something immediately. It tells us panic, real panic. The kind of panic that crushes logic and survival instinct in a matter of seconds. The kind of panic that makes trained people abandon boots, heavy clothing, supplies, and the only shelter they have in temperatures cold enough to kill in minutes. That is what makes Dyatlov Pass so frightening. Something happened that made those 9 people believe that getting out of the tent right away mattered more than getting out safely. At first, no one knew any of this. The group was expected to return and send word that everything was fine. When no message came, people were concerned, but not immediately alarmed. In such severe conditions, delays were not unusual. But as the days passed, concern slowly turned into fear. Eventually, a search operation began. Volunteers went out first. Students, teachers, experienced hikers, people connected to the group. Later, military personnel joined the effort. The landscape was vast, the weather brutal, and the odds of finding the hikers quickly were low. But on February 26th, the searchers finally found the tent. What they saw raised more questions than answers. The tent was partially buried in snow, but still recognizable. Inside were many of the group's belongings: boots, warm clothing, food, and equipment. Things no one in their right mind would willingly leave behind in a place like that. And then came the detail that would define the case forever. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Outside the tent, searchers found footprints leading away from the campsite and down toward a nearby forest. Some of those tracks suggested that the hikers had left barefoot, in socks, or with minimal footwear. That made the whole thing even harder to understand. It is one thing to imagine people stepping outside for some reason. It is something else entirely to imagine them doing it half-dressed, in darkness, in snow, in a place where the cold could destroy the body in a very short time. The tracks led toward a wooded area, and near the edge of the forest, the first 2 bodies were found. They belonged to 2 of the hikers, and both were badly underdressed for the conditions. They were found close to the remains of a fire. That tells us something important. At least some of them reached the trees. At least some of them tried to survive. They did not simply run blindly and collapse. They made a fire. They tried to think. They tried to stay alive. Even in the middle of fear and confusion, they were still fighting. Then, between the forest and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered. They appeared to be positioned in a way that suggested they had been trying to return to the campsite. Back to the tent, back to the supplies, back to the boots, the clothing, the little bit of safety they had left behind. And that detail is heartbreaking, because it suggests a moment of realization. Maybe whatever drove them out had passed. Maybe they understood that the cold was now the greater threat. Maybe they knew that if they didn't make it back to the tent, they were going to die. But none of them made it there. The last 4 bodies were not found until months later, after the snow began to melt. And this is where the case became even darker. Those 4 were found in a ravine under deep snow. Unlike the others, some of them had severe internal injuries. One had a fractured skull. Others had major chest trauma and broken ribs. And one of the most disturbing details of all involved Lyudmila Dubinina. She was found without her tongue. And according to multiple reports, there was also damage to soft tissue in parts of the face. Once details like that became known, the story exploded into something much larger than a tragic accident. Now it sounded violent. Now it sounded unnatural. Now it sounded like something from a nightmare. And that is exactly why so many theories were born. Some people blamed the Mansi, the indigenous people of the region, suggesting the hikers had entered sacred land and been attacked. But there was very little evidence to support that theory. There were no convincing signs that outsiders had violently confronted the group, and no strong reason to believe the Mansi were involved. Others focused on the Soviet government. The Cold War was underway, and the Soviet Union was known for secrecy. So many people began to wonder if the hikers had stumbled into some kind of military test. Experimental weapons, secret operations, rockets, radiation, cover-ups. That theory only became more popular because reports claimed that traces of radioactivity had been found on some of the clothing. And once that detail entered the story, the mystery took on an even darker tone. Then came the stranger ideas. UFOs, strange lights in the sky, a yeti, some unknown creature in the snow, paranormal forces, a cursed mountain. At some point, it felt like Dyatlov Pass had become the kind of case where every possible explanation, no matter how extreme, would eventually be suggested. And that happened because the facts were so deeply unsettling that for many people, ordinary answers simply did not feel satisfying enough. But maybe ordinary answers feel weak only because the reality itself was already horrifying enough. Over time, investigators and scientists kept returning to one explanation that had been discussed almost from the beginning: an avalanche. At first, many people rejected it. The slope did not seem steep enough. The tent had not been buried in the dramatic way people imagine when they hear the word avalanche. There did not seem to be obvious signs of a massive collapse. So for years, that theory felt too simple, too clean, almost insulting to a mystery this disturbing. But later, studies suggested something more specific. Not a giant movie-style avalanche, but a slab avalanche. According to this idea, when the hikers cut into the snow to set up their tent, they may have weakened part of the slope. Then, over the next several hours, strong wind may have carried additional snow above them. Eventually, a dense slab of snow could have broken loose and slammed into the tent. If that happened, suddenly many parts of the story start to make sense. A sudden impact in the middle of the night, confusion, fear that a larger collapse was coming, possible injuries to some of the hikers, a desperate escape into darkness before they could fully understand what was happening. And in a moment like that, people do not stop to calmly get dressed. They do not line up boots or organize supplies. They move first and think later. That could explain why they cut open the tent. It could explain why they ran toward the trees. It could explain why some had worse injuries than others. It could explain why some later tried to return. Even some of the more horrifying details, like the missing tongue and damaged facial tissue, may not be as mysterious as they first sound. In remote wilderness, over weeks or months, bodies are exposed to water, ice, pressure, decomposition, and scavenging animals. Nature can do terrible things without any need for something supernatural. Still, even with the avalanche explanation, this case never feels completely closed. And maybe that is because Dyatlov Pass is not only a scientific mystery, it is also an emotional one. It forces you to imagine what those people felt on that mountain. The confusion inside the tent, the sudden rush of fear, the freezing wind, the darkness, the sound of people shouting, maybe trying to help each other, maybe trying to understand what was happening. The pain of the injured, the horrible realization piece by piece that they were trapped in a situation they might not survive. That is why this story remains powerful. Because even if the physical explanation is mostly correct, the emotional weight of it never goes away. 9 young people went into that mountain with training, confidence, and a plan. They had experience, they had equipment, they had each other. And still, in a single night, everything collapsed. No monster is required to make that terrifying. No paranormal force is necessary. The mountain, the weather, the darkness, the cold, and one moment of chaos may have been enough. And honestly, that may be even scarier, because it means the truth is not some impossible fantasy. It means the truth may be something painfully real, something sudden, raw, and unforgiving. Maybe Dyatlov Pass did not become a mystery because the answer was impossible. Maybe it became a mystery because the answer was too human. A moment of panic, a wrong decision made under pressure, a desperate attempt to survive, and then silence. So what really happened at Dyatlov Pass? Maybe we will never know every detail. Maybe we will never fully reconstruct that final night. But whatever happened up there, one thing is certain. Something made 9 experienced hikers believe that the frozen darkness outside was safer than the tent they were in. And that is the part no one can forget. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to watch another mystery that stays in your mind long after the video ends, there's another video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.